Hello, everyone, and welcome to this hybrid event on private sector actors and approaches in education. My name is Chanwoong Baek, and I am Academic Director of NORRAG. Today's event will follow this program right here. Thank you so much, Camille, for sharing the slide. After my short opening of the event, we will have a panel discussion with 5 speakers. I will give a more proper introduction to each speaker later. After that, we will open the floor for the Q&A session and discussion with the panelists. At NORRAG, we plan and organize our strategic activities to enable our stakeholders to first know what robust evidence exists, and second, amplify knowledge that is context relevant. Third, access underrepresented knowledge relevant to their work. And finally, act, meaning that they work with context-relevant knowledge and expertise to formulate priorities and solutions. At NORRAG, we have 5 thematic focuses. The first one explores how can data and evidence support the inclusion of marginalized groups in learning. The second one examines how does equitable and quality education overlay and intersect with other SDGs. The third one investigates how do innovations and disruptions improve access, equity, and quality in education. And the fourth theme explores how can private sector approaches in education uphold access, equity, and quality. The final focus is on the network, where we focus on further surfacing and amplifying underrepresented expertise, particularly from the South, and deepening and extending our outreach and partnerships. And among these thematic focuses that I just shared with you, this particular event falls under the private sector approaches theme of the strategy. As you may already know, NORRAG is the Global Education Center of the Geneva Graduate Institute, but also we are a global network for international policies and cooperation in education and training with more than 5,800 members from 179 countries across the world. I invite you to check out our work and explore our network further by joining our membership, which is free, if you're not already a member. So please scan this QR code to join our network map. I'm going to pause for 5 seconds so that you can take out your cell phone and take a screenshot. Thank you so much. Now, I'd like to introduce the amazing 5 panelists who are here with us today. We have 3 speakers with us in the room, and we have 2 who are joining us online. The first speaker is Marina Dreux Frotté. She is a research associate at NORRAG for the Innovative Financing to Leave No One Behind project and education policy evaluation and learning lead for the GPE Kicks Hub. Marina holds extensive expertise in designing, monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems, and conducting policy research on education, financing, inclusion, globalization, and curriculum reforms. The second panelist we have is Moira Faul. She is the Executive Director of NORRAG and Senior Lecturer at the Geneva Graduate Institute. She has published widely on education and international cooperation. Also, she has produced many important studies for international organizations, including GPE, the UK government, UNESCO, UNHCR, and ActionAid. Our third panelist is Emon Nandi. She is an assistant professor at the Center of Excellence in Teacher Education at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Her academic and research focus spans economics of education, education and development, and higher education. Emon is a key member of the TEST research team working on innovative financing for education to leave no one behind project at NORRAG. The fourth panelist is Prachi Srivastava. She's an associate professor at Western University. She is renowned for coining the term low-fee private schooling. She has provided evidence to various organizations on donor policy regarding the financing of private schools. She has led high-level policy briefs during the pandemic and was also an invited expert on education disruptions for UNDESA, UNESCO, UNICEF, and other organizations. Our final, but not last but not least, panelist is Clare Woodcraft. She is a fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. Clare's work focuses on impact capital in the Middle East, particularly on philanthropy and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. She has held many leadership roles in the sector, including CEO of Emirates Foundation, Deputy Director at Shell Foundation, and Chair at Air Foundations Forum. Now I'd like to welcome all panelists to the stage. Marina, Moira, and Emon are joining us in person, as I said before, and we have Prachi and Clare online on the screen as well. I'm also going to join the table. I hope everyone can hear me well. So I have prepared some questions for our panelists to explore, and hopefully we will also get some questions from the audience as well as the audience who are joining us online. And the very first question that I would like to open the discussions up with is, why is it important to discuss private sector approaches in education? And how does your work in particular relate to that topic? So I would like to propose that we start with Prachi and then go to Clare, and so that we can have the online responses first, and then we will go Emon, Marina, and Moira. So Prachi, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very sorry that I could not be there in person. Yes, so the topic of non-state private engagement and non-state private actors in global education has, over the last 20 years, especially in the context of low and low middle income countries, has increased quite significantly, both in terms of research interest, but also in terms of what's actually happening on the ground. And that, I think, is, the number one issue that many of us who are interested and concerned about questions on equity, inclusion, and concerns about what this means in terms of marginalization. Those are the main driving factors for many of us that are interested in terms of thinking about persistent exclusions. My own work, I've been working on the issue of private non-state engagement for more than 20 years. And I, started looking at questions around what I termed low-fee private schooling. And now that's caught on. It's interesting how those small fringe topics, because my very first experience of speaking about low-fee private schooling at an international conference was back in 2004, in the context of, in those days, the EFA goals, Education for All goals. And I was told at that time that, we really shouldn't be spending any time thinking about this or talking about this at all. That it's a fringe topic, it's not particularly important, and that actually, it's something that will just sort itself out. It was at the time quite a prevalent view taken by many academics, but also by funding agencies and also by donors. And we, of course, now 20 years down the road, see that actually is not how things have evolved in a very short amount of time. So the questions for me that are remaining are questions around understanding the different modalities, the different actors that are involved, because it seems that different actors are all lumped in. We have a very difficult time to understand the heterogeneity of the types of actors that are involved, and also and the modes of operation and the domains of operation. Are they involved in financing? Are they involved in provision? Are they involved in regulation? Are they involved in management? Those are the four key areas that I would suggest that we think about. And then, of course, we look at the scale of operation. At what scale are the actors engaging, and in which capacity? Are they engaging at a very local, micro level community context? Are they engaging at global, high-level, venues, and of course everywhere in between? So that it's quite a complex issue. There are certain areas that get a little bit more attention than others in terms of looking at this, and particularly, I think a lot of concerns have come up about commercial private actors involved in basic education spaces, where what we would like to see is a much stronger role for a more effective, inclusive education sector more generally at the level of provision. And so, I think I'll stop there. But this, I think, is it's a topic that we can have a series, I think, of seminars on. It's no longer can we, no longer would anyone, I think, be satisfied with the answer. Oh, just don't worry about it; it'll sort itself out. We're beyond those days.
Thank you, Prachi. Clare?
Yes, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here. Excellent and timely topic. Just to start by building on what Prachi said, I mean, I think the heterogeneity of when we talk about private sector actors is indeed part of the problem. Who exactly do we mean by the private sector? So my focus, my work is all on philanthropy and has been for many years. And of course, philanthropy is private sector capital, but it is in principle for public good. So quite different from commercial capital. And yet it is sourced from the private and often from commercial entities. And that in and of itself can create some polemic, since people are often concerned about the source of philanthropic capital. And I think there is indeed, we all recognize there is this need now when we're looking at SDG funding, be it for education or other sectors, that we have to take a multi-sector approach and a multi-actor approach. Why is that? Well, of course, COVID has exacerbated the problem. SDG funding is estimated, the gap has gone from $2.5 trillion to $4 trillion. We know that there has been, particularly in the global south, a decline in foreign direct investment, but also in public sector funding, and indeed overall in investment, due to concerns about capacity and about overall the impact that COVID had on some of these economies in the developing world, which I should say my focus is very much on the global south. So I think that's the first issue. Why are we looking at private capital? Because we need additional sources of funding. That's the first thing. Now, philanthropy brings with it the opportunity that it is a growth sector. So we know that there is an intergeneral wealth transfer coming in the next few decades, particularly from the global south. So there is, this is $1 trillion capital market if you look at philanthropy globally. Although if you look at philanthropy that goes into development, it's currently only around 7% of ODA. But why address this topic? Quite simply, as Prachi was saying, that this is a massively complex, these in general, the SDGs are complex socioeconomic challenges that are often entrenched, and thus not issues that governments alone are going to be able to resolve, and clearly not issues that can be resolved without engaging private sector capital. So how my work relates to this? Well, we have been looking specifically at philanthropy in education and what is the opportunity of philanthropy in education. And indeed, our latest book has case studies on examples of where philanthropic capital has been able to innovate, catalyze innovation with the public sector, because philanthropy is risk capital. So to cite just a few, Tanoto Foundation in Indonesia was able to fast track its work and its partnership with government on the back of COVID. Similarly, the YTL Foundation in Malaysia, both of whom have chapters in our latest book, are really looking at how they were able to provide risk capital to governments who could then scale up the initiatives that emerged from these kinds of collaborations. So I think what the focus of our work here at Cambridge is really on looking at that. What is the opportunity for philanthropy to drive innovation in education as risk capital that can be catalytic for public sectors, which simply don't have the luxury of being able to take that kind of approach towards the development of the education sector. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Now let's turn to Emon.
Thank you. I am adding another dimension to the heterogeneity that they talked about. And I'd like to talk about the corporate social responsibility in education sector. So the concept of corporate social responsibility, or CSR, is not new. Companies had been investing, in some sectors which would directly strengthen their main business activities. For instance, building a transport system which would carry raw materials, or building housing for their workers' well-being, or establishing a school where the workers' children could go and study. But recently, I would say around 1950 onwards, there is a change in our expectations. And now we expect that apart from just safeguarding the stakeholders' interests, rather financial interest, by focusing on the main business activities, we expect the business organizations to demonstrate some responsibility towards the environment and community in which they work in. But the multinational enterprises and multinational corporations are also come under the global CSR guidelines. And then they are supposed to go beyond the location in which they are working, going beyond their community and going beyond the sovereign nation where they're located physically. And that makes a good call for requesting them or asking them or demanding 20% of their CSR spend in global education sector, because we were just talking about the global financing gap in education, which has increased tremendously after the pandemic. Now, if we talk about the MNCs and the global CSR space, we also need to keep in mind that the country-specific regulations are there also. I can talk about my country, India, as well as UK, China, Indonesia. They all have their country-specific regulations or guidelines, which are similar but also with different characteristics. So in India, we have the Companies Act 2013, which legally mandates the business organizations, both public and private, who come above a certain profit threshold, to spend 2% of their net profit in the CSR-related activities. I also think that we need a different framework to look at the CSR interventions where it is legally mandated, because here we see that they work closely with government as well. So I always think it's a kind of a framework of public-private partnership, which is more useful to study CSR in some countries. And right now, there are changes as well in their approaches. For example, we are studying Haryana Literacy Development Impact Bond as part of the IFE to LNOB project. And there, the CSR organization have also partnered with the DIB's Development Impact Bonds. So we need to keep in mind that as our values, expectations, and social norms are changing, the CSR approaches are also changing over time. So hence, I think it is important to discuss CSR approaches in education sector in a discussion forum like this, because we need to really see how effective the CSR interventions are. Also, we need to juxtapose the CSR interventions in a state, market, community kind of a framework. And third, it would be pertinent to see how they negotiate their CSR policies and interventions in a hyperlocal, local, national, and global context. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Emon. Marina?
Thank you. I'll be adding to the complexity that Prachi mentioned in the beginning, to say that in NORRAG's innovative financing for education work, we have been particularly looking to private investments in education. And this is because we have been seeing the last decades really a lot of experiments in this area, private actors investing in education programs through providing funds to service providers to implementing organizations. But we're here, I think it's important to clarify that when we're talking about investments, there is an expectation of return. So these investments means at least that the private sector actor is getting their funding back, or that they are getting some return with it. We are talking also under the umbrella of the impact investments idea. So basically, the idea that those private sector actors are interested in both financial return and social return when they're making these investments. So we've been seeing these in different forms. A very common one has been the provision of upfront capital or working capital to results-based financing programs. So the idea that the investor will come with an upfront capital that will then be paid back based on the results achieved. Throughout these different experiments, we've been seeing some, we say, argued potential benefits and challenges with these approaches. And I'll mention some of them. So on the potential opportunities for these private investments in education is, first of all, the idea that engaging the private capital markets will leverage additional funding for education, so we will address the public sector funding shortage for education. The idea also that it will bring improved education outcomes, so it will mean that these type of arrangements will bring more effective results for education. Also, the idea of increased efficiency in spending. So with the same amount of money, these investments will bring more research, more results, or with less costs. And then there is also the potential transfer of risk from public sector to private sector. So the private sector would be taking up some of the risk that public sector would have in funding education interventions. But there are also a lot of argued potential risks for these investments, and some of them are that the public funds could be used to pay return for private sector instead of being used for the provision of education, of public education. There is also the risk of the high focus on results, which could mean that these programs would focus on easy to achieve results or easy to measure results in education. There's also the risk of perverse incentives. So if the funding is attached to the achievement of results, there's a risk that will be gaming in the system to make sure that results are achieved. And there is also a concern regarding the unequal capacity of public and private sector actors in engaging in such discussions. So if there is a contract negotiation, private sector could have more information on the complex financial structures, which public sector actors might not have in those contractual discussions. So as I mentioned in the beginning, these are perceived risks and potentials of private investments in education, and these are arguments that we've seen from several perspectives, from academic researchers, from governments, from financial intermediaries, and from the private sector itself. However, we have very little empirical data about this. And this is precisely what we are trying to address in our innovative finance for education work at NORRAG. We are looking to how these innovative financing approaches with private investments are contributing to the achievements of education, whether and how they are doing so. And we are doing that by researching several innovative financing initiatives in the Global South in partnership with private financing partners. I can tell you more about that in a bit. And we're also looking to the existing secondary data on this evidence. So existing initiatives, what we already know, and how can we contribute to the fields on questions related to program effectiveness, financial risk transfer that I mentioned earlier, and also the financial return involved in these investments.
Thank you so much, Marina. Moira?
Thank you. So I'm going to
add a different dimension as well as to the complexity. And I think it's one of the reasons why we wanted to have this event, was to make sure that we were able to talk about these things, and specifically on public-private partnerships. So from the end of the 1980s, public-private partnerships were just on a rise in terms of the numbers. They ended up being, permeating throughout the SDGs. Yes, they are one part of SDG 17. They're also in the preamble. They're also in the 5 Ps. They are just there, front and center. Potentially flavor of the month, potentially a trend. Then it was partnerships, and then it turned into big data. And now it's AI and innovative financing. So there are these sort of trends that we need to watch, but also be very aware of the legacy of what has actually come before and what it is that we can learn from what's come before in terms of being able to then work through into some of these new dimensions, these new ways of working in terms of private sector actors and private sector approaches. So the main reason why it's important to me to discuss it, to research it, to really look at what's going on is because people are doing it. And if people are doing it, there's no point in being ostriches with our heads in the sand. And then on top of that, because people are funding it. Mm-hmm. And if people are funding it, what happens where money goes? Activity follows. That's something that we can be sure of. And also, it's not going to go away if we ignore it. So, and then also because we can't make sure that it is actually contributing to quality, equitable education, which is NORRAG's mission and mandate, unless we can actually be saying, here is the evidence, and also here are the narratives, or indeed the counter narratives to what sometimes can appear to be a narrative of the private sector as the white knight on a horse that is going to ride in and save education and development from itself. And so how do we do that? How do we think about that? So in terms of evidence, asking the question, how much money is actually coming into education from the private sector? How much of that money is going into what kinds of activities? How much is going into generating profit? How much is going into providing schooling? How much is going into specific innovations that may certainly be useful? I'm not saying that innovations are not useful, but how do we actually track how much is coming in, what it's being used for, and how it actually contributes to that goal of SDG 4? Because let's be really clear, the private sector actors who are engaging in education, I would say, are certainly saying that what their goal is in investing in CSR, in philanthropy, in partnerships, their goal is to support SDG 4. Their goal is to support quality, equitable, accessible education. And so then also evidence to hold them to account for that as well. And then also asking if it is being used for quality and equity, who decides what that actually means? When we say quality, what do we mean? When we say quality, do we literally mean literacy and numeracy and nothing else? Because the people who are working in philanthropies, in the finance sector, in the businesses, in the corporations, who have been successful enough to be in a position to be taking that decision, did not get an education that was literacy and numeracy alone. And so how do we then round that out? And the last NORRAG special issue that Hugh McLean edited and Chanwoong contributed to as well is particularly talking about that. How do we talk about foundational learning in a way that is really useful? Clare gave an example of private sector de-risking the public sector. And we also need to take note of the fact that at the same time, there's also an awful lot of public finance that then goes into direct de-risking private engagement. And so how do we actually think about those things? And differentiating, my last point, as Clare said, there's a huge plethora of different types of actors. If we can start from a differentiation between business actors and finance actors, then go to which actors are working with a market logic. And a market logic is talking about market competition, red in tooth and claw, where we're competing for customers, for clients, for whoever it is, in terms of providing something that is a quality service or product, versus those that are working with a corporate logic. Because a corporate logic is also a private sector logic, but what that is talking about is market capture for monopoly and monopsony, which we see in various different spaces in education, in health, in many other places as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think all 5 panelists wonderfully elaborated on why the private sector approaches in education is such an important topic to explore further. And it is indeed very fascinating, but not too surprising that it is a very complicated issue. But because it's a complicated issue, there needs to be a deeper discussion and further exploration on this topic. But as Marina pointed out, the discussion on the evidence regarding this topic is not necessarily one of the most discussed topic in this field. So I would like to now turn to the second question, which is more about the evidence-informed approach, right? So if we start to acknowledge that this is happening, this is already happening, and many people have shown, many actors and stakeholders have shown interest in this, then we want to make sure that these approaches actually contribute to the equitable and quality education, right? Then how can we be sure that these approaches taken by different stakeholders indeed can contribute to the equitable and quality education? And one of the ways for us to explore that would be how to make that practice, or how to make the private sector approaches more evidence-informed, right? So my second question to all of you will be, what do you see as the biggest barrier to more evidence-informed private sector approaches, and ways to actually address that biggest barrier? So now I'd like to start from the ones who are sitting in this room, and then go to the people who are joining us online. So why don't we start from Emon, Marina, Moira, and then Clare and Prachi.
Okay. So I would like to address this question from a researcher's point of view. And I would like to clarify that it's not the case that there is a lack of evidence generation or data collection in the CSR field, because the business organization collects a lot of data. They have a very sophisticated MIS system, and their implementation partners very regularly feed in the field level data there. They also reach out to independent evaluators. My organization, my institution, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, as a part of the team, I have conducted multiple evaluations of CSR interventions. But none of these reports and this data are available in public domain. So we actually abide by a very strict non-disclosure agreements with the business organizations when we conduct these evaluations. So if a researcher wants to conduct research on the effectiveness of the CSR interventions, they will not have access to secondary data or secondary reports. Also, it's not only about collecting evidence. I think it's important to see how they are using the evidence to make it more impactful. That's a gray area for us as well, because we don't know the suggestions we made in the reports for mid-course correction, how far they were implemented or not. That's the first issue I would like to point out. Secondly, there are some methodological challenges as well for evaluation. For instance, right now I can talk about my country. Most of the interventions are very ad hoc and one time, like installing a water purifier or even supporting a government scheme which is already continuing, or providing some funds to the Prime Minister's relief funds or the centrally sponsored funds. So it's methodologically challenging to evaluate the exact impact and attribute it, because these are not long-term programs. So that is an issue we also faced during our evaluation. And the other problem is there are some systemic issues. For example, even though we have a legal mandate, that only requires the business organizations to report what they have done. So how many science fests they have subsidized in school, or how many water purifiers, or how many school bags they have provided. There is no requirement for uploading any evaluation report or showing the impact that they have created through their interventions. And we also know that, so even if we assume for a second that the business organizations are interested in evaluation, because it is not very incentivizing for them to do it, because the robust evaluations are also very expensive, and there is no provision for parking that amount in their CSR expenditure. I'd like to stop here.
Thank you, Emon. Marina.
Yes. So, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about several challenges, but they are all very important. And some of them are very related to what Emon just shared. So I think, especially when we're looking at private investors in education, transparency and data sharing is a key challenge. So it's very difficult for researchers to have access to data on these private investments. And there are frequently, even when researchers do, there are a lot of non-disclosure agreements involved in that access to data, which makes it very challenging for the expansion of research in these for these interventions. There is also, I think, a key challenge, which is the concern from the private sector side on reputational issues. So at the time that they're opening the books for researchers, there is a fear that the findings could harm their image. And that would mean also financial loss for them. Another challenge we've been seeing in our work, especially in researching private sector investments in education, is that very frequently there is some kind of evaluation involved in these impact financing mechanisms, but this is perceived to be enough. So there is a very clear objective in these evaluations, which is to verify whether results were met or not. But even though it is important, this is not sufficient to build the evidence on the field, which we believe can only be built with independent researchers coming on board and really looking into issues of how that private investments in education compares to traditional finance. What is it contributing to in the whole education financing space? And really asking the questions that are not frequently asked. Another challenge, I think, is one that Moira was also referring to. There is a lack of dialogue between education experts and impact investors in education. So sometimes it's a very split discussion in which one side thinks we have enough evidence that this doesn't work, and the other side says we have enough evidence that this works. In our work, we're not seeing all of the evidence. We are just seeing that there is a lot of anecdotal data available on the different initiatives, but a systematic effort to research the contribution of such private investments in education is not there yet. So we at NORRAG have been seeing some fruitful opportunities for addressing these challenges, and this is to engage in partnership with private investors who are interested in improving their financing mechanisms, and more importantly, that are interested in responses to those key questions on whether these different types of investments in education are contributing to quality and equity in education.
Thank you so much, Marina. Moira.
Thank you. So I have two biggest barriers. The first one is very, very quick. The first one is that it's hard. It just is. And we need to recognize the fact that changing your own practice by taking on board evidence is hard, unless you already wanted to do it to begin with. So let's just, put that on the table first. The second barrier that I think is also extremely important here is the fact that what is done is never done on evidence alone. And we need to recognize the politics that are involved and invested in this whole thing, and also the question of the polity being who gets to make the decisions. So I referred to this a little bit previously as well. But fundamentally, we have these polarized positions, and the polarized positions is either don't do it all or do more and faster. And actually, that's exactly what it is that Marina was talking about, the need to address that polarization. So how can you address that polarization and uncertainty? So one way is to address through evidence. And that is NORRAG's approach, to take an analytical approach to these questions and to see what is the evidence for private sector approaches, and the evidence also, the other part of the work that we do in theme 1 is actually thinking about what is the evidence about how to improve the use of evidence in policy and practice. Not just keeping on doing what we've always done, but actually saying, what is the evidence of how to improve that? Which is where my first point, it's hard, came from. And then another way that it can be addressed is to address these things through laws. And the Abidjan principles is one set of principles that basically went through international human rights law and said, what is it that is international rights law that would allow us to say the private sector needs to stick to these particular precepts if it is to engage in education? And then finally, address it through norms. Because fundamentally, private sector actors, and let's be very clear about this, public actors too, say they want to support equitable and quality education. Using the norms means that we can then say, how do we hold you to this? And like I say, private sector actors and public too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moira. Clare.
Yes, hi. Just picking up on Moira's point and earlier points of my colleagues. So it was good to hear Emon say that she's seeing more and more research on, CSR. But what I see in the philanthropic sector is that we are spectacularly bad at basing programmatic interventions on research and evidence and data. And I think part of that is the nature of the power structures within philanthropy. And, call it ego, call it power imbalances. But there is a tendency within, and I'm talking here a particular kind of philanthropy, I guess, larger foundations, private foundations, even corporate foundations that sort of surmise what the socioeconomic challenges that they want to address and jump in without necessarily having rich, robust data that can inform the nature of their intervention. Mea culpa, hands up. I've run foundations and have, in fact, one of the biggest conclusions of my experience working with foundations is, goodness me, you need to do the research before you start to create the programmatic intervention. And very sadly, that's not what happens. What happens is people get very excited about philanthropy. They have, a well-intentioned drive to intervene, to solve a problem at scale. And unfortunately, often what gets lost in that good intention is taking a step back and saying, have we truly understood the problem that we are trying to resolve? So, and I think, but there's also a power issue within that, in the sense that too often, philanthropy particularly large, well-resourced philanthropies from the global north have this assumption that they understand what's happening in the global south and will jump in to create solutions that don't necessarily respond to the actual data-based, evidence-based needs of the global south. Now, that is, of course, being addressed at the moment by this wonderful new movement, the Shift the Power movement that has come out of, South African, Sub-Saharan African, really gone global now in terms of calling for philanthropists to really understand the power dynamics and make sure that they have the data and the evidence and the local voices before they start. So that is a big part of the barrier. The second barrier is that people are often, and philanthropy is often unwilling to fund research and evidence. Again, there is this focus on jumping into the programmatic work that is high profile, that builds reputation, because people want quick wins in the sector. People are unwilling to accept that impact is intergenerational and may take decades before you can see it. People want to be able to report back to funders, to boards, that they have engendered system change. And that means that there is a speed to interventions that simply doesn't allow for taking a step back to do the research, and the appetite is not there. And finally, there's also a capacity issue. So many philanthropic institutions, particularly those in the global south, may have insufficient resources to be able to invest time and energy in sourcing data, undertaking research, and there may be pressure on them. And the reality on the ground, there's pressure to intervene, to act quickly. So there's I think, various reasons as to why there are barriers, but I do think that in terms of solutions, that is changing. In my own career in philanthropy over the last 30 odd years, I have definitely seen a shift towards much more institutional capacity around things like, for example, developing a theory of change. It's the big thing now. Most philanthropic institutions have a theory of change, which is a good thing, because a theory of change inherently implies that there has to be some kind of rationale, evidence-based approach to the intervention. So that's great. But we still need to do more. So that was very much our mission here at Judge Business School when we set up the Center for Philanthropy, was to do more research on philanthropy in the Global South, because quite simply there wasn't enough. So even if one does want to take an evidence-based approach, if the data is not there, how are you going to go about it if you don't have the resources or the appetite to create that research? So we need more research. We need more case studies. We need more funding for research. We need more postdocs. We need more work, such as the work that NORRAG is doing. We need more capacity building within philanthropic entities so they can address some of these institutional voids and create the capacity to build an evidence-based approach. And finally, I think we need more advocacy so that this best practice is more common, because our sector does suffer, philanthropy, from these institutional voids where you don't have, for example, very active professional networks. Now that is changing. There are now some strong global networks in philanthropy, but they are only recently going to scale. And historically, we simply didn't have the kind of professional association convenings, best practice that would push for a more evidence-based approach, build that capacity, and therein also encourage greater transparency, going back to the points made by some of the other panelists about, being able to share exactly the research and the data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Prachi.
Yes. I would like to take the prerogative of going last and also being an academic, which gives two points to this. The first is, in terms of the points that have been made by the panel, I think, we can all broadly agree that there needs to be more research, and that the use of research is not a linear pathway of having evidence and then applying it. Where I think, where we have gaps, there are significant gaps. One is there enough research on certain topics and certain issues? And I would say probably not. And that isn't for want of researchers or institutions or even actors, the private sector actors themselves wanting the research. There are a host of issues that impede that kind of work being done. And primarily, I would say a lot of that just goes down to incentives. As an academic, we have the prerogative of talking in theory. So I'm going to talk a little bit in theory. And as a new institutional theorist, I look at this and I ask myself, okay, why is it that we don't use the evidence that's there? And why is it that we don't create more evidence where it's not there? There are many brilliant people working within private sector, and outside of private sector, who can tell you what the gaps are. The issue is, what are the incentives for non-state private actors, A, to develop that, and B, to actually use it? And those incentives are not always internal. Sometimes the incentives have to come from an external source, and sometimes that has to come from a regulatory body. In the case of India, that Emon has mentioned about the CSR initiative, that happened really because of the Corporations Act of 2010, 2013, and then actually the government regulating that and saying you must do it, you must report. There's also an FCRA. Any non-state private actor receiving, or trust or charity in India receiving foreign contributions, must post that online every quarter for anyone to see where that money has come from. Beyond that, there's very little regulation. And I'm saying this as somebody who's been working on trying to track the financing of education initiatives across Asia for the last 10 years. And I've developed a database, but let me tell you, it's been very difficult, because outside of countries that have explicit incentives of regulation, the US is one of them. If you're a private foundation, you must report using the PF90, I think form it is, you must report that. And that is why the published research then becomes skewed, because where we say, okay, why is it that we don't have research so much on the global south? Why is it we only have the predominance of research is coming, at least in the philanthropic sector, is coming from the US? Because where are the legal regulations to prompt reporting? Some of these are internal, and of course, yes, we want to share and we want to know. But having done research on a host of non-state private actors, what I've learned is that there are two things: there's gatekeeping and there's data hoarding, and there are different incentives associated with that. Some of them are perverse, some of them are not. But that question around barriers of evidence, it's not a neutral question. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to leave it at that. But my final kind of point on this is, where do I see, an opening? And where I see an opening for this is open data and public data. Mm-hmm. What we need is to have what we need to have is fewer disconnected individuals, researchers, institutions doing work. And what we need is really a global movement for open data systems and public data collection and reporting that can actually be shared in an open manner for whichever mode of non-state private engagement one wants to look at. One wants to look at CSR, one wants to look at philanthropic engagement, one wants to look at, private investment from corporations, whatever it is. But there needs to be this movement for that, because without that, what we have is individual researchers, institutions, doing work which can be scaled, but we really need our incentives for reporting and ways of verifying that data. Once the data become public, there are then mechanisms for verification, either through different bodies, through institutions, through the public, through those actors themselves. So that's where I see an opening, regardless of whichever particular thing we're talking about. I think it's, how do we actually bring this into the public domain, understanding the use of evidence is ideological, and we cannot run away from that. That is the actual fact, both by public and non-public bodies. It is an ideological political process. And so how can we bring at least data into and I mean data writ large, how do we bring that system into the public, into the forefront, where we can actually then have much stronger verification questions and accountability questions answered?
Thank you so much, Prachi. I think the answers shared by the panelists are so amazing because it addresses many different dimensions. So when it comes to the production of evidence, there was a discussion about the timing when the evidence is produced, whether it's even before a program or the approach is developed, or during the program, or even afterwards. And also there was a question about the content of evidence, whether that actually addressed local needs or not. And there was a question of once the data and evidence is produced, and whether that is actually accessible to the public. And also there is a question of funding and feasibility of evidence production, and also to what extent there are resources not only for the producers of evidence, but also for users of evidence. And regarding that, Prachi in the end also pointed out the importance of regulations and incentives around this topic. One particular aspect that I want us to explore further is this idea of collaboration part, because there were some themes raised by multiple panelists regarding this idea of fear, right? When engaging with private sector actors and public sector actors, and also the intention of these actors involved in private sector approaches. And also, of course, there is a question of power. So considering all these complex issues regarding intention, fear of being judged, and also the existing power inequality and so on, my third question for the panelists is about, what do you see as opportunities then? So now we just talked about the barriers and how to address them, but what do you see as the opportunities for engaging with private sector actors, for improving their contributions to quality, equitable education? So for this question, we are going to mix up the order a little bit for fun. So let's start with Marina, and then go to Clare, and then Emon, and then Prachi, and Moira. I will keep track of the order so you don't have to memorize. So let's start with Marina.
Thank you. So I'll make reference again to some of our NORRAG work, because in the recent years at NORRAG, we have been having a lot of dialogue with private actors who are actually interested in research and in building evidence around what they're doing in practice. And some of them have been shown interest in engaging with research at really early phases of their investments in education, and in spirits of building evidence that they can implement and adapt their approaches based on that evidence. In our innovative financing to education, leave no one behind projects that Emon mentioned earlier as well. We have really engaged in these partnerships with private investors in education to conduct formative research. So this idea that we are not only looking at these private investments in education once they are done, but as they go along, and that these data can be useful in then making course corrections, adjustments to the design of the different programs and mechanisms, in the sense of improving their contribution to quality and equitable education. Another opportunity I would mention is promoting dialogue between researchers, private actors, implementing partners, and funders. I think I have mentioned before the challenge of these two groups not always talking to each other and speaking very different languages. So this is also an opportunity, and we've been pushing for that at NORRAG, be that in online activities, but also in person, in bringing these different perspectives together for experience and evidence sharing, and with the idea that it's very important for both sides to understand each other's language and perspectives on what they're doing. Because I think some of the online panelists were also referring to that. Everyone is there willing to contribute to SDG 4. But if we are not speaking a common language and understanding these different perspectives, we are not contributing to each other's work. Another opportunity is the strengthening of capacity of private sector actors, and I think Prachi was talking about that as well, in understanding key education considerations for equity and quality of education. So if Moira was also referring to this lack of understanding of key education aspects. So sometimes they're experts in the financing design, but not really engaging with those that can be contributing to the design of the education programs and understanding also the impact of the financing approaches to the education program. So another example of our work at NORRAG, we have an executive education course in which we are precisely trying to bring these different actors together and speak a common language to really adopt analytical approaches to private sector engagement in education, more specifically innovative finance engagement in education, but asking the critical questions on the contribution to quality and equitable education. And lastly, one key approach that we've been doing at NORRAG as well is to keep private investors as a target audience for our research products. And I think that is a real challenge. A lot of the evidence that is available out there is in a format that is not so inviting to those that are directly involved in practice, in financing. So we are making that effort to make sure that we are synthesizing the existing evidence in using formats and languages that we also cater for this audience and that we can, with that, also invite them and bring them to the table.
Thank you so much, Marina. Then we will go to Clare.
Yes, thank you. So I think there, and again, I speak specifically about the philanthropic capital. I think there are three areas where there is an opportunity to contribute in a way that is impactful and systemic, equitable. The first, I think, is really just to reinforce this idea that philanthropic capital is risk capital, as we've already said. But what does that mean? That means philanthropists can experiment where government might not. So just to give you the example of the foundation I ran in the Middle East, we wanted to create a program for financial literacy that could be embedded into the national curriculum. We worked with the Ministry of Education. They said, we don't have the resources to develop that, to create it, to embed it. If you can fund it, sure, let's partner on that. So we funded the research behind that, building even teacher training capacity, and then the government took it and scaled it up. And I think that's a great example of how philanthropy can support development and education, specifically around curriculum development. But I think the opportunities are thwarted somewhat by governments. Again, one of the panelists mentioned this, Prachi actually mentioned it, the challenge around regulating the sector. So governments historically have been very suspicious of philanthropic capital. Where is it coming from? It's coming from the civil sector. How do we, civil society rather, how do we regulate that? How do we, how do we ensure that this doesn't threaten regimes in some cases? So I think we need to really build that trust. And I think COVID helped a lot in government starting to understand the opportunity of working with philanthropic capital to bring about innovation in education. So that's the second thing. And the third and final thing, I think philanthropy needs to be deployed to offset some of these power imbalances. So where we see education systems in the global south that have been, historically developed through colonial legacies, philanthropy can create an opportunity to fund locally driven education, development of education, both policy, both deployment, because it has that freedom to go where the gaps are. And I think that's a growing area where we're going to see more philanthropists and the movement of South-South collaboration and Global South philanthropic capital coming from Global South sources move into that space and say, we want to see locally driven development, locally created development and educational development opportunities that historically were superimposed from the global north. So I think there are very significant opportunities, but again, we need to build those collaboratively and across the ecosystem, because when individual philanthropists start to work alone, it simply doesn't work. You don't get that system change.
Thank you so much. Emon?
Thank you. I think for CSR, we really need to shift the focus from compliance to purpose and impact. And if we look at the global performance assessment standards right now, so there are several standards available. For example, the Tripartite Declaration for the MNCs and their social policies by ILO. And also there is one by OECD guidelines for MNCs. So these are all compliance standards. Similarly, there are several voluntary standards for CSR or the social impact that the organizations create. Those are also available, SA 1000, etc. But I think the most difficult issue is to make it more meaningful in terms of equity and sustainability. Marina also mentioned it. In case of CSR, I felt that even though we look at it from the lens of public-private partnerships, and generally we see that the risk is transferring, major risk is borne by the public sector in some of the cases, but in these cases, it's the reverse, or it's the perceived fear of the business organizations that if anything goes wrong in the local community, their main routine business activity will be jeopardized, and that would be very difficult for them. And I have seen that they have provided digital devices to schools for use of children. They're happy to do that. But if a student coming from a very vulnerable background is barred from using that device by any teacher who is not very empathetic, they don't say anything because they don't want to interfere in any of the issues which might, raise a controversy in the local community. So I agree with Marina that we need to build partnerships with them. We need a trust-based research environment where they don't feel threatened to share their data with us or themselves to use it for mid-course correction. Rather, they see a value in doing all these so that they can create more and better impact in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Emon. Prachi?
I'm going to go slightly off script here because I think the opportunities that have been discussed are relevant, and I made my comment about the open data, public data. I think that really is the major, that I think would bring a big change to the environment of, research, accountability, evidence, a host of, issues associated with that. But I think it's important to understand, and this is, where I go off script a little bit, is that we're talking about education. It's not the same as talking about non-state private sector intervention in constructing a bridge or a road. This education is highly, highly value-laden. It's ideological, it's value-laden, it's political. And I don't know why it is that when we approach education and the ills of education, especially in the global South, we tend to discuss it primarily as a technical enterprise. What is the evidence? What can we use? How can we make things better? I don't think most of us who are sitting in the global North or West, however it is you want to identify that, would say that about our own systems. In fact, I'm pretty sure none of us would agree that this is a technical enterprise when we're talking about the schooling of our own children and our own countries and our own schools. And yet, much of the discourse around how do we make education, quote unquote, better? How do we achieve SDG 4, whether it's with partnership with non-state private actors or not, is much taken in a technical way. And of course, there's a technical aspect to understanding how systems work and how systems run. But at the end of it, it is quite a political process. When we take for granted the assumption that there are necessarily scarce resources for education and there are necessarily scarce public resources for education, we are taking that as an uncritical assumption. That is actually not the case for a number of countries. And the case is that still, even today, despite the increase in non-state private actor engagement, the vast majority of financing in the vast majority of countries is actually provided by the state. There's some intervention by ODA actors, and there's a trickle of financing when it comes from private non-state actors. Now, that's according to reported financing and what we can measure. It may be that some of the figures are different. But again, we go back to the question of what do we actually know? And what we know is what we can see based on the data that we have. And based on the data that we have, it's still primarily a public national enterprise. It doesn't mean that all of the discussions we have around globalization, I'm a scholar in that field myself. It doesn't mean that none of those are relevant. It just means that we have to be very, very, I think, careful when we uncritically accept those assumptions as being fact, because they're actually not fact. There are, of course, problems and major problems with the global governance of education. There are major problems at the level of nation states. There are issues that we would not like government to be a part of, especially authoritarian, undemocratic governments, which we are also seeing a rise in. And there is opportunity for real non-state private engagement there, and in the form of civil society, in the form of perhaps philanthropy, to come in and actually support much more open systems. But, the opportunities are much more along the lines of how do we address the assumptions underlying our education systems? And I do say our, as in globally ours, not just ours as in the countries we live. How do we take that on? And how do we actually challenge both government public sectors and private private non-state actors as well? Because it's not just one or the other. There are issues, but at the end of the day, the evidence that we have, and it's maybe not evidence that people really want to agree with because it's problematic. And I'm the first person to say that we have huge inequities in education. But the evidence that we have is that strong, inclusive, good quality, publicly accessible systems really are the way to achieving broad social mobility and broad access in society. So then how do we achieve that? So I'm going to end there because I think, the questions are much larger than just looking at private sector interventions, kind of looking at that in the context of systems level. And then education then necessarily becomes much more a cultural, sociological, political, ideological endeavor than we sometimes actually, pay attention to in global kind of discussions.
Thank you so much, Prachi. Moira.
Thank you. Thanks, Camille. So I think the first thing that I'd like to say on this point is when we're talking about partnerships, which is my sort of slice of the pie that we are dealing with, is it's really important not to lose sight of what each sector can do on their own. Following on from what Prachi said, what Emon said about the regulation and how that can enable or not. So governments are there to regulate in the public interest, and that is what is on paper as the role of government. So let's not lose sight of that. The private sector can choose not to, for example, pollute. The private sector can choose to make sure that labour standards are maintained, that teacher contracts are maintained, that teachers are respected professionals and not just supposed to follow a script, that there is student protection in place. Anyone who's dealing with education, private sector, public sector, civil society can all do that. So really important, make sure that we're very clear on what it is that each sector can do on their own, as well as looking at partnerships. Regarding partnerships, whether you think they're a good idea or not, the promise of partnerships is simply not being realized. And so one of the things that I think is very important, and I'm just checking what's on the screen behind us, is also to think about the importance of partnerships and how it is that actually, in terms of this book that we put together in 2022, what is the partnership? What are the pathways to effectiveness? So it's not just about saying we're going to have a partnership and job done. What are the pathways to effectiveness? So the first one, yes, it's up there, is goal attainment. But that's not enough because you can set a goal for a partnership that's this big when you're dealing with a problem that's this big. The second one is then value creation for partners. And the value creation for different partners on different sides of the table can be different, and that's okay. as long as nobody's feeling or being exploited. The third one is collaboration inside the partnership that Marina and Clare have also spoken to. How is actually that collaboration and those relationships working? Very clearly, really important. The impact on affected populations is absolutely crucial. And the final pathway to effectiveness is thinking about the influence of this collaboration on institutions outside the partnership. And so these 5 pathways to effectiveness in partnership are the ways that we found in this book. It's open access. So if you click on the QR code, you can find that online. This is there, as well as a series of different chapters using this framework, but really thinking about what that effectiveness means when we are talking about partnerships there. And really important, everyone around this table has referred to power, even our chair and moderator, and the private sector doesn't get away from the deepest and most pervasive development problem, which is that people choose to ignore the fact that the South also knows. Anyone who's had anything to do with NORRAG knows this is a key initiative that we have. And it's not just words. We also make sure that we are bringing marginalized experts and expertise to the table, and particularly from the Global South, and making sure that that is taken seriously, and taken seriously also in books such as Clare's recent book that we'll put the link in the chat on reimagining philanthropy in the Global South, and our policy insights on models of philanthropy looking at regional differences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moira. Now we have some time for questions. So I would like to open the floor to the audience in the room first. And we have gotten some really interesting questions online as well. So we will get to those. But is there anyone who has questions? Yes. And we have a microphone so that people online can also hear you. Give us a sec.
Hello. Okay. I don't know, is mine a question or more of a comment? I don't know. So, like Prachi was talking about, India has a lot of low-fee private schools here. And I've worked in rural India for 2 years. And while working there, what I noticed was that these low-fee private schools are somewhere creating a kind of gender inequality in the communities, where a family who can afford to pay fee for one of their children are sending their boys to these low-fee private schools because these families think that these schools have better learning outcomes, and they are sending their girl children to the government schools, which are generally free of cost, or they have minimum fee. So what can be done to mitigate these kind of inequalities that are very unintentional, but they are being created more or less somehow? That's my question. Thank you.
Prachi, I think perhaps you could answer the question.
Yeah, so generally the literature shows that private provision private schooling generally favors certain groups and certain groups of children, and there is a gender dimension to this, and it's actually mitigated by wealth. So it's actually usually it's poverty and then gender. That's usually what we're seeing in the literature from the Global South. So what you see is where households are more constrained, they will then have to make decisions in terms of who to school, which children to school at all. And then when they take that decision of whom to school, where they would school them, and then for how long they would school them in whichever school they choose. There is no easy answer to this. The answer that I've given to this over the last 15, 20 years is the same, which is that when you have such a variety of unequal access, and that's because of failure of strong public systems, you will continue to see these kinds of disparities. And this is the number one problem with many systems in low and low middle income countries where the actual access is limited, both in terms of the facilities, but also in terms of quality. And unless there's real interventions to look at the system as a whole, we'll continue to see this. In the case of India, where the municipal governments have stepped in, particularly in Chennai and in Delhi, where they've stepped in to do targeted partnership approaches with nonprofit, community-based other models where private sector can engage. What we've seen is, for example, in the case of Chennai Municipal Corporation Schools and in Delhi, at least the anecdotal evidence and some initial evidence emerged that there was a change that actually, and then people stopped using the low-fee private schools and re-enrolled their children in the municipal corporation development schools, because those schools actually increased the what they were offering. They were offering a better quality. So, the idea in the literature that, parents necessarily prefer private schooling, that's not actually the case. The case is parents prefer schooling that they can access, which doesn't have barriers, and good quality schooling, which doesn't have barriers for all their children. That's been my experience in fieldwork over 20 years. So, again, it's a systems level question, and it's not an easy answer, but that's kind of where we're seeing the literature.
Thank you for the answer. I'd like to raise a question to Marina. This is a question from one of the online participants, and this is related to the answers that you have given previously. Could you please expand on what more effective results mean and how they are measured and chosen? And the same question on efficiency. So how are these two, if the question on effectiveness and efficiency, defined in the politics that have been implemented, in the pilots that have been implemented so far?
Sure. Happy to address that. And those are actually some of the key concepts that we are exploring in our research, and precisely going beyond those terms as buzzwords, and actually going to how we are actually seeing them taking practice. And let me start with effectiveness. So the idea of the argued potential for private investments bringing more effectiveness to education is the idea that because a lot of these approaches are focused on results-based financing, that's public actors or others financing education will only be paying for actual results achieved. So that's that guarantee that if the financing is only coming if the results are achieved, the payments are only coming if the results are achieved, that will make sure that we are reaching the education outcomes that we want in a designed program. On the efficiency side is the idea of the cost of reaching those results. So how much does it actually cost to achieve those results? And that, to be honest, is a key question we have in our research, because there is very limited evidence on that. But one of the argued potential of such private investments in education is that they will be able to more efficiently achieve the results. So that means spending less resources, less financial resources in achieving the expected results in education, but also maybe with the same amount of financing resources reaching more results. So the idea that the fundings will be better spent in the pursuit of such education results. But again, I want to emphasize that we are currently in the efforts of building more evidence around this, because these are very common terms discussed in the fields, but we've seen very limited comparison to say that these private investments in education are more effective or more efficient than the traditional public funding for education.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for Clare, but because we are running out of time, hopefully if you can answer in a brief way, that'd be wonderful. I apologize for that. But Claire, there is a question from the online participant that I work for a public school board that doesn't make decisions based on evidence. I run a philanthropic foundation that uses evidence to make funding decisions and expect that from donees. Why is there an assumption that the public sector makes decisions that are evidence-based and the philanthropic sector generally does not? So if you can speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's so clear that that either one does or doesn't. I think all actors need to focus more on data and build policy and decisions based on data. All I'm saying is the philanthropic sector, because its governance is more flexible, it's private capital, and in many cases there aren't specific regulations. It's easier to have a modus operandi that is less rooted in policy data.
Thank you so much, Claire. My last question goes to Emon and Moira. So there is one question from the online participants who said, in my context in South Africa, our problem is trust when we think about engaging with relevant actors. How is the panel dealing with this issue? So Emon and then Moira, shortly.
No, as I mentioned, in my context, it is similar. Trust is the most difficult, concept, I would say. But I also have kind of a, question which is linked to that, and I'd like to ask Moira, is that okay? So I was thinking that when you talked about partnership and collaborations, so I have come across consortia which have all the actors, all the partners who are very powerful. And we talked about the global power imbalance. So do you think that when in a partnership, all actors are very powerful, maybe a civil society organization, maybe a private actor, or the high-performing, service providers, they come together, is there a chance that they could amplify the power imbalance? And that could be a challenge in some of the partnerships?
Yes. So thank you for the question from South Africa. I'm from Zimbabwe. Thank you, my neighbor. So I think, trust, the first thing I would say about trust is it's a practice, it's an action, it's not a feeling, it's not a concept. And so that's something that is sort of, you build trust by doing trust by working together. So it's holding that sort of as a very active participatory thing to do. It's a doing word. And the other thing I think about trust is that it's very culturally specific. Not that trust is culturally specific, but where it comes and how it comes. So there are particular sort of areas of the world where you build trust, and once you have trust, you sign a contract. There are other areas of the world where you sign a contract first, and because you've got the contract, then that means you can trust the people that you're working with. And this was a discussion I was having just this lunchtime. And so if you have those two different cultural views and you don't understand from your cultural perspective that this is where the other cultural perspective is coming from and where the expectations are, you can't have the conversation. All you're going to say is a no, one way or the other. So that sort of understanding between cultures and between different ways of doing things is extremely important. Power imbalances inside partnerships are extremely, extremely frequent and difficult to deal with. And that is something that is absolutely true. And then when you have one sort of powerful group of people who then get together, then it's like, the space-time continuum, and you have a lead ball in it, and it kind of distorts the whole system around it. There's no question about it. And in the same way, if you have a partnership and there's one powerful actor, it distorts the whole system around it. And so being able to think in that systemic way is really important. What is most important, and all of my research for the last 10 years has shown this, is that you can have, as a less powerful actor, you can have the most beautifully detailed understanding of the power relations around you and your position in the power play around you. And it doesn't make the difference that one powerful player recognizing their power, recognizing their role, recognizing their relationships, and saying, hang on a minute, this is where I step back. This is where I hand the mic over. This is where I go and look for relations with others who are in different positions of power. And it may be that you're sitting in your organization and you're sitting there going, I'm this teeny tiny little cog in the wheel, but when you walk into a room where you're negotiating with a civil society actor or with a school district leader, you are the most powerful person in the room. And knowing when you are and how to play it and how to work that is an art, and it's a really important one.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I think that is definitely a wonderful message for us to end this panel discussion. And of course, the conversation doesn't stop here. And I strongly encourage you to continue this conversation even after this event. And that said, related to these themes, the theme of today's events, I would like to draw your attention to other resources and work of NORRAG related to this topic. So 2 volumes of NORRAG book series on international education and development explore philanthropy in education and Abidjan principles on the right to education. And we have a QR code right there for you to scan and take a screenshot. We also do extensive work on innovative financing for education, as Marina and Moira was referring to, and also Emon earlier. So once again, take a screenshot or take a picture of the QR code for you to explore that further. We also have 2 upcoming events at NORRAG. The first one is a hybrid symposium entitled Exploring the Global Reform Scripts of Development Partners. It is scheduled on May 9th. And the second event is on May 29th on the right to preschool education. Please use these QR codes right up there to learn more about each event. But also, as you can see, the time slots are a little bit different. So make sure to identify the time that works for your time zone, depending on where you are located. I also like to direct you to the South Also Knows initiative. The South Also Knows initiative feature the experts from the South in our own network, as well as their work and scholarship. We aim to contribute to reversing the North to South flow of expertise and decision making. Please join our movement using this QR code. So, as the final note, all participants who attended this event will receive a follow-up email with the event video recordings, event highlights, and the link to the publication. In the meantime, please let us know how we can improve the next event by filling in the evaluation form that will be shared after the event. And also, please don't forget to join the network if you haven't already. Once again, thank you so much, the wonderful panelists who are here with us in the room and also who joined us online, participants and organizing team at NORRAG for your time and participation. Thank you.